Hello, this is Liam here from Sector 3. This is a recent recording of a session I did with a number of chief executives from health and social care organisations on things that they as leaders should know to help to lead their organisations into a digital age. I'll hand over to myself now, historical myself at least, and I hope you find it useful. I'm going to talk about the journey and the story of where we're going and what our organization needs to be to go there and to stay there. But more pertinently, in this session, I'm not going to talk through your digital transformation. I'm not going to talk through the specifics of this, but the journey that everyone's taking. And I suppose the important role that you as a leader can and hopefully should be taking as we move forward. Now, I set myself a little bit of a challenge because for those of you who are not aware, I run what is now a 100-hour disruptor program, which includes loads and loads of learning around all of these topics in a lot of detail for those people who are the disruptors in the organization. And as I'll come to at the end, I'm going to be talking a bit about the executive program that we're running and that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I'm going to be trying to cram all of that into 1 hour, which I suppose, just to settle the ambitions slightly, is that today what I'm going to be trying to talk a little bit more around is the flavors, is the different elements that ideally we want to be cognizant of and to try and make sure that we're thinking about in combination as we move forward. So just by way of introduction, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Liam, and I suppose in a nutshell, what I do is help organizations and leaders and staff within those organizations to take digital head on and win, to try and understand the real change that is happening in what is often a very confusing landscape of trying to maybe see some technologies that you may or may not understand and see how they could be applied and how your organization would look entirely different. I do a number of different things. Our organization supports a number of different people. My background was 17 years in the health and social care service, built a national program and spun it out as a CIC. It's still going successful today. And we've helped the NHS save probably over 2 billion in medicines and prescribing savings for our policy and community work that we did. Since that time, I've been working in a number of different fashions. I was special advisor for NHS England Improvement recently and dip in and out around the digitization of the community health program. I led the response to medicines for NHSX when we got into COVID and was trying to look at how digital and data solutions could deal with some of the complex challenges that we are facing in that age. I have lectured to and mentored with the Royal Navy, the RAF. I'm involved in the MOJ Ministry of Justice Prison Leavers program at the moment. I advise a whole host of technological companies that work in the cutting edge of this area. But I suppose what I do and the way that I describe my day job is either directly with organizations like yourselves who are working in health and social care predominantly. I help them to be able to understand that journey and how to be able to move forward. And so hopefully this is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And so now we've kind of got past the bit of talking about me, I'd like to talk about you. Or what I might be talking about is you. I don't know. We're all coming from different places and we're all, seeing digital in lots of different ways. But the resounding stories that I often hear in private discourse with leaders is that looking forward to the future, there's a fogginess, there's a lack of clarity around what steps to take and how to be able to take those and what all of this future, very different kind of future that we're talking about is actually going to mean as we move forward. And why wouldn't they? Because there are more curveballs and challenges. There are more surprises coming from the system, whether that be legislative or, we'll even add in pandemics as well. And there's lots and lots of stuff which is coming through and it's starting to kind of take the feet away from under us. There is significant uncertainty about what we should be doing and where we want, where we need to be, particularly if we are beholden to public sector institutes and who are often responsive in should we say, a slightly more populist age than we've been in the past. But also the things that we're being asked to do, and perhaps most importantly, the things that we're being asked to do are often more complex in nature. We're being asked to do things that we've never done before. We've been asked to be able to deliver outcomes before the problems have happened, to be able to stratify risk in ways that we haven't, to be 24/7 in people's lives and to be able to, spread the thin resources that we have, when actually we don't really have any more resources. And that's a real challenge that I think many, many, many leaders, actually, I don't really know many leaders in our sector who aren't facing this. I suppose one of the bigger questions, particularly off the back of COVID, is, well, how big is digital? How much a role does it play in what we do next? Is it the whole bag? Is it part of the bag? How big should we be going with it right now? Like, how much do we need to know and understand? And when is too late? Particularly fitting given the COP discussions we're seeing on the news at the moment. Um, and perhaps more personally, a number of leaders are also asking, like, have the rules changed? As are the things that we've been doing, often we're finding that we're struggling to get to work, or we're being told that we need to be doing differently by systems, particular ways of thinking, particular ways of thinking in modern management journals around how we need to take a very different approach and how leadership potentially needs to be quite different to what it's been before. What does this mean and where's it come from? I think I also have a number of individual stories that often come into my mind, which relates to that individual leader and I suppose their relevancy in their current organizations. For example, if we are doing more digital and if we're trying to take these approaches, well, how do I fit in with this? Like, should I be passing it down or on to people, or should I be having to learn and get involved in this? Like, how should I be governing these, and what role should I personally be playing? To borrow an example of an outgoing leader of an organization, chief executive quite recently, who basically described himself as a dinosaur and said, you know what, now's the time for me to get out of the way because I don't understand all of this digital stuff. I feel that we need younger bucks to take us into that new world. And I don't think that I'm really the person to be kind of doing that. And do I have the knowledge that is needed for this? I had a leader of a well-known charity recently in a one-to-one session sort of said, so we've taken all the right steps, we've got the right people and skills in, but actually myself and my peers at the board, having all of these things brought to us, but actually we don't know what a good decision looks like. We don't know how to govern this stuff. We don't know when it should be delivered and how it should cost. And we're all kind of having to trust and rely upon others to actually tell us whether these strategies that are going forward are right. Should we be telling them to go bigger and better and more, or should we be saying that's too much or that's too risky? All of these questions are ones that I hear time and again from different leaders. And I'd just like to spend a moment with you, because if this is you, if perhaps you're feeling this pressure, particularly for those of you who, but perhaps would describe yourselves as sort of long-term established leaders, you may have spun out of the system and created the CIC in the first place. What a challenging situation that is to be in. How difficult that must be as the person who's probably been the lightning rod of your organization and the person who's most connected to the mission in the future, to feel those difficulties around whether you are able and whether you're the right person to do that job. What I'd like to talk about in this session is that I think you are, and I think there is much that you can do without knowing around technology. And a number of leaders, from all different walks of life and, regardless of how established, are trying to take that step with digital. But when they do, often it can be quite confusing and they can be, slightly confounded by all of the technological, should I be learning about technology? Should I be learning about agile and design methodologies or something? What should I actually be doing? And I suppose on behalf of millennials with computer science degrees like myself, I should apologize because we have not made it easy. And actually, when I think about it, we've done the same thing that systems often do, or that cultures and communities, as we've kind of taken all this sort of higgledy-piggledy jargon and acronyms, and we've made it all so very difficultly confusing. So we as individuals can kind of hold on to this. And that's very exclusive. And that's very difficult to know actually where should I start and what should I do with this? And, we do absolutely need to move beyond this. Because at the end of the day, the future is not a journey that some of us are going into. It's the journey that we're all going into. And actually, the thing that we're going into, as I explain in this session, is something that is going to affect every single one of us as we move forward. And we all need to, within our organizations, we all need to move together and be on a vessel that moves into the future. That is one thing that we're absolutely unable to avoid, that we're all moving forward, unless, of course, the vessel sinks, which none of us want to see. And regardless of all of these digital technologies and these individuals who do digital roles, we still need a captain. And your role is absolutely critical. And so today, I would like to talk about why that role is critical and some of the things that I think you should be focusing on in order to be able to try and play that captaincy role. So the first question, how big is this? How large is this change coming and what do we need to treat it as? Well, depending on whether, depending on how you feel about it, I feel very excited about the age that we're going into, regardless of some of the perils that we're about to see. But actually, I think it's almost increasingly inevitable now that we're not just going into the next industrial revolution, we are in it, and it is starting to move faster and faster and faster. And actually, by industrial revolution, we talk about revolution is an overused term. We use it all the time, and we often talk about revolution in a number of different ways. But let's just go back to the basics of what a revolution means. The fabric of society, everything around us that touches upon pretty much every part of our lives, like in the first machine age, is going to be transformed by what we're about to go into. Hopefully, I can explain a little bit more about why. So the reason for this is that the operating of society is shifting. We are moving from an age which went from feudal to industrial, as we did a couple of hundred years ago, and we're now moving into a very different system around us, which is going into the model of the most important power that is transforming society, which is the interconnected lightning speed global network of everything. By everything, I mean people and technologies and internets of things and data and all of these different things that string together to bring us into this new world. And this is already happening. We're already seeing this form of disruption start to shift and change. And if you're not, I suppose, familiar or dare I say comfortable with the term disruption, and you don't have a positive feeling around it, the term disruption I'm using is the one was initially coined by Karl Marx, but then taken on by the economist Joseph Schumpeter to talk about how industries, so your industry, all of the different industries, going through a consistent and continuous process of revolutionizing the thing around us. So not just changing what we do, but destroying systems around us and incessantly creating new ones, starting to go through and change the world around us as we see it and to take us into a different place. Now, within this revolution, quite specifically, what we're talking about is cognitive work, cognitive jobs are going to be automated in the different parts that you break them down. And the predominant power of this is going to be artificial intelligence. It's going to be machine learning and all the different flavors of AI that we're using to confuse everybody at the moment. So I suppose to put this into a different perspective or a different prism, in the first machine age, what happened is a load of big clunky machines powered by coal came along, and before it came along, the vast majority of people were valued in society by their physical power, their ability to pull soil in a field, to be able to pluck carrots and to be able to basically feed ourselves. And then the machine came along, and what it largely did away with over quite a significant period of time was people being valued as physical laborers. In the second machine age, the digitization or the digitalization is effectively going to come and take away the cognitive things that we do, the problem solving, the abstract thinking, a lot of the learning we do, communicating, analyzing information, and a lot of the decisions that we make on a more day-to-day basis, a lot of the more routine things that we do. Just to point at some of these, this is a significant part of your workforce, of our workforce. Even if we work in care, even if we take apart people's jobs, there's quite a lot within this. And what this takes away is the second domain of human power and leaves us largely with one more, probably the most important one, which is social emotional skills. What makes us human? The way that we create, the way that we think, the way that we cooperate, all of the different slightly more generalistic skills that we have. And so actually what this means is the jobs are going to shift. And to put this into a bit of an experience that many of us have had, I don't know about you, but I remember when I was younger, bank holiday weekend, driving down the M40, about to get onto the M25, and mum and dad are arguing. They've got the A to Z out. They're arguing about whether we should take the 404 and where the traffic was going to be and so on and so forth. And largely that decision making was analog decision making based on a book. But now we've changed what we put our faith in. No longer is dad or mum right. The person who is now writing the car is a collection of data points from thousands of other vehicles on the road, starting to say, well, actually, if you take this route, it will be 55 minutes quicker or slower, and there's accidents coming up, and your journey time will probably be this, and X, Y, and Z. And realistically, most of us, I don't know, if I got into a car nowadays and someone pulled out an A to Z, I would be pulling my phone out pretty quickly because my trust is in data. But actually, we're not that far away from changing our trust into data being the main leader of how we make our decisions, and where effectively we get to the same point that we have in this, where we say, why would I trust an A to Z when we've got all of this information here? And so effectively, once we start taking The middle sort of application that we have here is that we're still making decisions. It's augmenting our decision making. Whereas here on the right, what we're talking about is that we would get into a vehicle, say where we want to go, and a million or couple of million cognitive decisions would be made probably every couple of minutes that would then get us to this individual point. And this same thing that we're seeing here, which is us moving to put faith in data above human opinion, human cognition, is going to happen across society. But we're also starting to see that the culture is shifting and the way that we think about our environment is starting to change as well. So, pun intended, I suppose, given the nature of the discussions this week. But actually, there's been a lot of discussion around this new workforce, the millennials. Are they snowflakes? About the demands that they're bringing. But actually, we've kind of also moved past that point, because realistically, I'm going to give you two facts which I think define why it's not about about millennials themselves, but actually about changing the system to fit them. Because firstly, millennials are now over 50% of the workforce in pretty much all developed nations across the world. In other words, they're the majority of the people who are going to do the work that you need. Number two, and I can speak as one of them, we are now moving into senior leadership positions. And now that we have this influence and power, we're starting to take this mindset from living in, being digital native and living in a digital age, and trying to apply that into our thinking about how we want the world to be. And this is going to have a significant impact on the systems, our organizations, and how they shift. And I think I work with people of all different ages. I talk with a lot of millennials, but actually as one myself, like just reflecting, like I pretty successful senior leader. My roles, my work is pretty much all entirely sort of social emotional. But actually, when I think about the uncertainty and the constant change that I'm expecting in the future, I have anxiety about it. I worry about it. I worry about my relevancy. I worry about my child's relevancy and what's going to happen, and making sure that I and those around me are prepared for the future that's about to come. And so for those millennials who may feel impatient or may be leaving all the time in your organization, if their anxiety about the need to constantly change to remain relevant in a society which throughout their life has been consistently shifting and changing around them and disrupting itself, if they're stuck in an organization where their job is feeling stuck and the organization is not moving forward, what are they going to do? How are they going to feel? And actually, as that number starts to creep towards 60 to 70% of the workforce, that then just starts to become a fixed point rather than a debatable point, really. And I already think that we're kind of past that point. So to take all of this together, the revolution is here and it's happening. We can't change it. We all know the stories of the Luddites. We can't push against the moving tide. And realistically, we can be disrupted by this change, as history has proven, or we can disrupt ourselves to change and shift towards this change. And because this change is so fast, the time ahead for us, or the time that we need to have, is one of moon missions. We need to be thinking big about the future. And so as a leader, what does this mean? Well, the first and foremost thing is that we need to not be leaders for the status quo. We need to be leaders of urgency and reform. We need to be starting to look around us and saying, what needs to change? What do I need to focus on that we need to change? Hopefully I'll be coming to some of that as we go forward as well. Often if you work in care, and I imagine this works with the vast majority of you, but often we've told ourselves a story that these jobs are very complicated, and we'll, within these roles, there's probably not much that can be digitized, and that's not really going to change. I see a different picture, and I think actually in care, and I mean health and care, social care, I mean probation services, whatever care might be defined as in the world, like effectively it could be described in a lot of the private sector companies as well. But actually, we're now probably on the verge of a catch-up revolution that is going to do some rather dramatic things. And so just to give an example of health and social care, because it does apply to both of them, this is what we were predicted to happen by a really fantastic report, by the Topol report by Dr. Eric Topol, MD, who's one of the leading thinkers around how health and social care will start to shift as we move forward over the next 10 to 20 years. And actually, when we think about what the pandemic has done and start thinking about the role of artificial intelligence and, reading the 2 million data points that come from reading the genome, we've now had major system imperative changes. We've all had the story from COVID and how it changed changed our perspectives and started to make us move faster, which has meant that there's more solutions being brought to a more confident market. And as a consequence of that, there is more investment going into that market. So we have the right economic circumstances that I think are going to actually accelerate this change further than we would have had otherwise. And the magnitude and speed of disruption will probably be coming within the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, and that's our time frame for thinking around some things that are really different. So when we think about what are what are these changes going to be, just pulling back to my comments around complexity, we need to be able to do more that we couldn't do before. We need to be able to stop things before they happen. And to borrow from a young Tom Cruise film here, what we're talking about is Minority Report approach, predictive analytics, starting to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to take massive parts of data and to say, if this happens, then it's quite likely that this will happen. And that as a consequence, we respond. Let me just visualize this a little bit and I'll go into health. So at the moment in health, we have a system, we have someone who comes in, they say, oh, I'm feeling a bit sick and I've had this and I'm quite depressed and, my knee's hurting and I can't walk. And we've got that tiny slice of time. But in the future, if we think about a general practitioner as an example, we're going to have a genomic blueprint with around about 2 million usable data points. I think it's more in the billions of actual data points, but the usable ones are about 2 million. What would we do with that? We're going to have a similar number of data points if, for example, somebody is sharing all of the different things that are being collected from their smartwatches and their smartphones and their real-time Internet of Things in their house. And that might be an elderly patient who's got sensors across their house to be able to monitor things, or it might be a young person who is digital native and using their data to stop things happening. We're going to have all of their health history and the interactions that they've had, which effectively, if it's done virtually or via digital, is something which actually is a rich data stream that you could pull apart to look at sentiment analysis, be able to use all different forms, which I won't go into detail around, of artificial intelligence to start to give us more rich data that we never would have had. There might be all kinds of things around our biological, our psychological, or our social markers, and our environments. And that, for example, not just the things that we're putting in on our sort of how do you feel today apps, but actually the light pollution, which, will be coming from our smart cities, and the sound pollution itself, and all of these different things that we'll be able to get, around where people live and, the profile of them and all these data points. So effectively, what we're talking about here is that things that will decide what happens in care, in all the different forms of care, will be big sets of data that we collect from a number of different points. And the first application of that will be, we will take these in their individual streams and we will seek to predict what happens as a consequence of those. But as this starts to get more complicated, and I'm just going to take this back to, if this is feeling a bit sort of, how do you say, technological, just think back to the analogy I did before around the A to Z going to the car that drives itself. What about if everybody else in the world has exactly these things as well, and we're able to create what would be called a digital twin? In other words, a profile of someone or something that is most like us. And we can say, well, that person, when they kept taking this medicine, they had a heart attack. But when they took this medicine, that when the people like us who didn't take this medicine, they had a better outcome. And so effectively what starts happening is, instead of us responding to this information, we get to a point where neural networks, which are big collections of artificial intelligence, which take apart all of the data that we collect and tell us things that we never knew, is going to start telling us all the answers. And it's going to start telling us all the answers in a way that's going to very rapidly become too much for a human to be able to digest and make decisions on. And so effectively what we start to have is virtual health, virtual social care, virtual care guidance systems that will largely integrate most of these systems as well, because actually they'll start to see that, this is a lot of why integration is happening, because we need to be able to connect these areas, together. And so effectively what that's going to start doing is taking us out the equation, and it's going to be doing nudges and then trying different things and learning from that in the way that machine learning does. And so effectively our day-to-day real-time health, social care supporter is going to be a smartphone with servers running algorithms all the time. And that might sound mental, but Facebook are doing that right now. Google is doing that right now. Amazon is doing that right now. The models are actually there. They just need to be translated and start to be used in care. And it will happen, because actually there isn't a lot of the technological stuff that needs to get worked out now. It's here. So what does all this mean? Well, we need to move out of our view about what care is and what is and isn't possible with care and start to think about the word that I've underlined here, which is progress. And we need to have a new mindset that we are going to this, that the skeptics we need to, of course, engage with, but we can't lead our view on skepticism. Otherwise, we're going to be wiped out of the picture by those who do get it and start utilizing these more efficient, more sort of cost-effective technologies and starting to bring around a very different kind of system for us. So all of this urgency means that you need to move fast. You need speed within this arrangement, and you need to be able to make your moon mission go forward. The problem is, and I mean this with all due respect to lots of different organizations, even the best ones that I know and work with, is that you're probably actually quite slow and encumbered versus what you need to be. You've probably got years and years of baggage, which stops you being able to move forward in terms of progress. And I'm going to borrow a term that comes from a fantastic book that I would think everybody in the universe should read, which is called Brave New Work by Aaron Dignan. I buy it for every client I work with, and on my accelerator, that's the book that I push everybody should read. And what it talks about is organizational debt. And what organizational debt largely is well-intentioned realities that have happened over decades where we've created processes and policies to make things safe and precise and so on and so forth. And effectively what's happened is that it's slowed us down. And it's not anyone's fault. We haven't done anything wrong, because actually what we've just done is we've worked in industrial age and we've used human nature. There's a fantastic article in Nature here, which talks about how if we are given Lego blocks, effectively most people try and solve problems by adding things rather than subtracting things. But if in this new age we keep adding things, then we keep feeling burdened, and this reduces our capacity. But also, if we keep doing this, it becomes the done thing, the way that we solve problems, the culture. It becomes the commonality of how we act when there's things that we need to do. And so effectively, one of the biggest things that we have around organizational debt is that we've just been adding for so long. Now, this may manifest in so many different ways within your organization: regular meetings, gateway decision-making policies that span over months that we have to go through, AKA hoops people have to jump through, operating procedures and policies about what people should be doing in specific circumstances, processes that we follow, and that cesspit that literally every single organization or staff in every organization hates, which is email, where we kill each other with all of our different cultural messes and keep on sending email to each other. Or if we're not careful, we create a chat app and we do exactly the same thing with that. In terms of what we need to do, we need to try and undo, like that's just the simplest way to explain this, is that we need to try and find a balance for the sake of progress. And what this means as leaders is we need to reconsider the amount of emphasis we put on knowing everything in precision and start to try and re-emphasize progress as a force that we need to have. And this means that we need to try, particularly for care organizations who hold people's lives in their hand, a balance for how we move forward for the sake of progress. Otherwise, this is what you're probably going to be leading into the future. This is going to be the burden that you have to carry. And in the age of disruption, what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to your organization? And what's going to happen to the prospects of your staff? There's many, if we can't find, the millennials will leave because they feel stuck in a stuck organization. There are too many environmental factors that could become the disruption that you face that ultimately causes your lack of existence in the future. So what do we want to do? What is the salve or the solution, or I won't dare say the panacea to this? Well, we need to reimagine our organizations to become something that is able and capable of evolving. We need to try and have an evolutionary mindset that all of the different parts of our organization are consistently moving forward and responding to our environment, rather than the sort of task and finish project approach that we've had before. Because we have to, because we're going to need this to cope with and respond to the challenges of the network age that we face, the uncertainty, the complexity, the disruption and shifts that many of you tell me about on a regular basis, and you feel the consequence, but many of these are created by this environment. Realistically, if we look at COVID, if we didn't have all of these digital tools, if we didn't have all of this technology, we would have had to just accept it. Whereas now, as we move forward into this digital age, the way that we've been made to respond, though our ability to respond was in itself complexity by using technology. That's how it worked. And that was because we're in this cycle of using more complex solutions to solve more complex problems and continuing to disrupt the environment around us, because this is the age that we're in. something I always refer back to and respond to is the responsive manifesto. And I definitely recommend that you have a look through and read it. And it doesn't talk about digital, but it talks about moving into a new form of operating system, moving into a new age where we can be responsive. And what this talks about, and I think some of the principles that you could take within your organization, is that we need to move away from the details and the numbers and the fixed points, often in private sector organizations, which is profit, to bathing ourselves in meaning and purpose and making sure that we're evolving in relation to the most meaningful things that are happening. Secondly, we need to try and move away from hierarchical sort of the way that we set ourselves up to more of networks. The model of the prevalent models of society, the technologies, are network age models. And so realistically, we are not the sum total of our org charts, but if we want to succeed and be able to evolve, we need to be able to consider ourselves many different flavors in participatory groups what people are part of. To move forward into a digital age, we need to not have a small group of people who make all the decisions and control what happens, but actually start to think about how we can empower everybody in our organizations to do it. If you don't make everybody in your organization part of your digital workforce over the next few years, you do not have the digital resources, capacity, or capability to move forward at the speed that you need to. And so the only way to do this is to empower the people who work for you to move forward and to be able to take those roles on. We need to stop, and I'm going to come to this in a bit more detail later, but actually we need to stop planning all the time and trying to get everything perfect and create a perfect view of the world and then bend it to our will. But we need to be moving more towards experimentation and our ability to connect at the point where meaning really exists. Corporate rebels calls this the iceberg of ignorance, where a lot of the time leaders make decisions about things they don't see rather than experimenting right at the face of where things are happening. And finally, as we're seeing in the whole of the internet, like the internet effectively is all of humanity's information being made available freely and immediately, more or less at zero cost. And we have all of the technologies that can support this. To borrow a term that we had at the very beginning, these sort of siloed things that are going on, we need to break open and move out of our silos and our specialisms and try to do more general transparency, because that is the ingredients that feeds what we need to be able to do and to allow us to connect to meaning too. So let's just make this leaderful, right? Let's talk about the leaders. So if we're talking about evolutionary organizations, then we need the role of the leader is to make sure we have the right conditions for evolution. Evolution responds to its environment and its conditions. And therefore, we need to be thinking about progress and our ability to respond and to be leading that. To take this forward, like I've talked through the societal change, I've talked through the system change, I've talked through how our organizations need to change. But actually, if we're going to split the atom and kind of break this apart, I think this is probably one of the most important things that hopefully I'd like you to take away from this, which is actually that change itself is changing. And that might sound like a strange thing to say, but actually the way that we change is changing. And for many years, you can see this, Benjamin Franklin says it's a pretty old adage, but for many years we have culturally told ourselves in organizations and society that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. However, often as we're starting to plan pretty well and try to plan as much as we can, when it comes to more complex situations or digital technologies, what we're seeing is the failure rate is going up. Well, if we're planning more and putting more time and energy into this, then why is it failing? The answer is because we're doing it the wrong way, and we're creating this view of reality which isn't necessarily cognizant of complexity, which I'll come to in a moment. And therefore, what actually ends up happening in reality is a very different picture to what our planning says. And this happens time and time and time again in so many different organizations. So the problem is I suppose within this, that we treat things like they are complicated, the industrial mindset. What we do is we treat things like they are a machine or like an engine. The things that are not human in nature, they work to rules. You can affect, your plumbing does not have feelings. It does not respond in an unexpected way. Well, I don't know, in my new house, my plumbing does sometimes, but that's beside the point. Your car is a perfect example. And so often we try to treat things as they're complicated and they are predictable. However, humans never have been predictable. They're organic, they're human in nature, they have feelings, they have a whole world outside, which we're starting to realize, of emotions and upbringings and all of these different things. And humans don't work to rules, which means that when we try to plan for things, the more human changes that we have, the less predictable they actually are. And so quite often we've been looking above the iceberg and looking at the new things, the systems, the predictable things, and using, different forms of applications to be able to measure these. And, there are still many things that are complicated that we need to look at, particularly when it does come to IT systems and so on. But actually, increasingly, if we don't start delving into the slightly murkier deep, to those things that are complex, the things that we don't see or that we don't address or discuss, i.e. cultural problems, sort of, various things that tend to just get swept under the carpet in organizations. And also the unintended consequences, the things that we can't necessarily predict, such as how a group of people will feel when we try to get them to change. And if we don't capture that learning and think about them as users and think about their change, then we're missing so much of stuff that's important. And it's increasingly important because actually, if you start thinking, okay, so as an example, 10, 15 years ago, we would have an IT system and it would have been fixed. It would have fit a specific specialism, a specific role, and you've taken it and you'd have implemented it. And it would have forced people to work around specific rules. Nowadays, we've got these M365s and we've got automation things and all of these different, more extensible open systems. And actually, what we're having to do is use those to define the way people work, the way people they communicate, the way that they organize. All of these things are complex things. And actually, the water level of this is rising, and increasingly the shift is more that we need to try and move out of that planning territory and into more of an exploring territory. And the world is responding to this. Hopefully there's some terms that you're quite familiar with here, agile, doing minimum viable product. A lot of people talk about lean design thinking. The problem often is that we try to put these things in like they are complicated things. Like, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to get our PMO and we're going to train them to do agile. And what we're going to ask them is to basically be all light and lean and to do things quickly. But at the same time, we want everything in advance. We want to know when it's going to happen, how much it's going to cost, and what's actually going to happen as a consequence of this. The problem is that means that we're effectively putting something in without the sufficient understanding of complexity or without having respect for how prominent and important it is. And so these fail. And then people go, oh, it's agile. It's just another fad. It doesn't really work. It does work because Google and Adobe and Intel and Toyota and these other organizations are incredibly successful because they use these to govern how they work. And they get complexity in a way that often we don't. So what we need as leaders is the complexity conscious leader who's going to raise the flag around us and say, we need to engage more with this. And actually we need to exist more in uncertainty. We need to be able to do things as they happen and to try and bring across that shift at board level in terms of the things that are requested down the organization. It's not something we can just do at the coalface and expect to happen. If, for example, we sat, and I've been there, sat in the boardroom where we've tried to work out something that's going to happen when actually we don't know what's going to happen. How on earth do we? Or, or passing questions down for more certainty about things that are actually not certain. So, we need to be able to have leaders who are driving this change and saying, do you know what, it's okay if we don't have all of the answers because we're going to be engaged with complexity. So to me, a great digital leader isn't someone who understands all the gubbins and bits and bobs of technology, but someone who's the complexity navigator in chief, someone who's driving the organization to be connected at the edges and trying to say that is where we're going to work it out and that is where we're going to be successful, not in a boardroom that is entirely detached from the things that we often see. But when we talk about organizational debt, well, of course, leadership often comes along with a sidekick, which is strategy. And strategy can be many different things depending on how we look at it. Quite often, strategy does a lot of these things like treating things like they're complicated. We want a specific costed solution of everything's going to happen, when it's going to happen, etc. But actually, if we reimagine our strategy and we rethink about what that could be, if we turned it from something that could be an organizational debt into an organizational asset, something that can galvanize and enable and inspire people around us to bathe in this meaning and to find their own missions to help the organization move forward. How different could that be? And actually, there's many, many examples of national organizations who don't write about the technology they do. They write about the journey that they want to take and what digital can do and be, so it becomes everybody's mission. So I rarely ever see strategies that look like that. But how powerful could they be if they raised everybody, if they were documents that people use to drive meaning and raise it around them? And how few and far between are these things? Because otherwise, this is what strategy is going to be, you know? And none of us want to see this in our organization, particularly when the consequences are so high. So I've been talking a lot about the soil, you know, talking about us as chief tillers of the soil. So, you know, realistically, technology is only as good as the environment we put it in. And so actually, if we can really think about the environment and or the petri dish and the soil that we have for growth, then this is a fantastic opportunity for growth itself, for progress itself, and for many things that maybe we didn't expect, many more things that we thought would be possible if we could seek to make sure that we have the right environment for this. One of the things that we often overlook, and everyone talks about culture, 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 culture. And, you know, there's lots of things that we do to make a great culture and so on. But actually, what lies under the surface and can often strangle the things that we're trying to grow is culture. It can be the thing that exists in hidden places and just grips these fantastic initiatives that we want to have and drags them down and kills them. And so we need to try and look at these roots, which are often process in nature, and start to think about them differently. A really good example, for example, you know, we have a problem, we need to deal with it. Everyone sends emails, it gets too much. We start having meetings, we keep holding meetings. We don't solve anything because we're crap at meetings and we don't have any purpose and people disengage. We keep having the meeting because no one is able to say, let's stop, because there's particular leaders who want to keep it going and everyone disengages. And then we've just got this organizational debt that is just filling up the time that we could be doing for very different kinds of things. This is the kind of thing that we need to look at and to start thinking about. Is this the best use of our time? Is this serving the purpose? And do we need to try and do less? So to borrow Steve Jobs, who was actually well known as being a massive micromanager and wanted lots of things to be perfect. So let's just take the sentiment of the idea rather than the person who said it. But what he talked about within this is about creating a culture where you are run on ideas, not hierarchy, where you run on the free form, free flow of ideas that come through our organizations and become the meaning that takes us into a new place. And those ideas have to be the things that win. Otherwise, like the millennials we're talking about, they will go. And so what we're talking about is a place where we are starting to build a progress culture and we're shifting from process to progress. Because after all, digital is a culture. Like, yeah, there's a lot of technology, but actually digital is a bunch of humans all moving together into a new place and doing things and being differently. That in itself, by definition, is a culture. And so effectively, we need to make sure that we're understanding and considering these cultural differences. So as a leader, we need those leaders who can address the process culture, who are willing to tackle it and to start thinking about this and thinking about reform towards a progress culture, the need for speed. Now, we've been talking about the individuals in our organizations. I'm just doing a very quick time check here. Okay, we're doing fine. And what we need to try and do is, you know, I suppose as I talked earlier about the move from cognitive jobs and social emotional jobs, quite often people in our organizations don't have these social emotional skills, these social emotional jobs. And actually, we need to help them to get there. Like, for one reason, because if we don't, we're almost failing them in our responsibility. Because actually what we need to do, like the way that we learned our social emotional skills when we were growing up or as we became leaders, was through having experience which helped shape those, helped to give us these experiences where we could use these kind of skills in a more general way, multi-application to be able to move forward, which is what leadership kind of is, right? The good news of this is actually this means that maybe we need to spend less on costly training programs for people where we teach them stuff and cognitive skills, specialisms, and actually start just saying, we're going to give you opportunities to do something, which if you're an FD on this session is hopefully music to your ears. So I'm going to borrow some concepts from a book by Greg Orme, who lectures at London Business School, has written a really fantastic book called The Human Edge. And it's not actually a business. I don't think it's necessarily a business book. I don't think it's a book about how to do it in your organization, but I've taken quite a lot from it because what he talks about is the individuals and how we move forward in the future and how we actually, what are the relevant skills that we need to have in this new age. And so he has in the center, the 4 C's, which are kind of the superpowers. And then around them, for each of them, there are 2 dance steps, as he calls them. And I think a lot of this is quite sort of fluffy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to to show you my reorganization of what I call the sausage machine, which effectively is the disruption or the progress sausage machine. Because actually, what he talks about in his book and the skills that he talks about is that we need to be starting to take people, give them the skills to be able to take things forward as part of a progress. People need to be supported to be bathing in meaning, to be able to connect the dots and come up with problems and be able to really start to drive purpose, because no progress ever happens without purpose. The next thing that we need is to drive what can be called a weaponizing curiosity in your organization, creating a cycle of learning and asking questions, and for pushing to become questions to be the fuel in the fire as you move forward, because that can be, instead of a vicious circle of disengagement, can become an incredibly powerful circle of engagement in your organization. At the end of the day, if we want everyone driving things forward and they are connected at the right point at the edges of our organization, that cycle of learning and questions can genuinely create what Pixar calls idea ugly babies, or ugly babies. And what that means is the early stage concepts where maybe there's some real gold in there, something that could be really great that we could take forward that could solve a problem from those who are looking to do things. Now, they're delicate, we need to nurture them, they're malformed, or hopefully not malformed, but they're not perfectly formed, they're not the finished product, but they're just something where we need to know how to be able to cultivate these. And so this is where, like I illustrated before and like I'll illustrate in a moment, digital age processes can actually really help us to be able to take these through the right kind of process. So those ugly babies become great actionable ideas. But of course, we want to collaborate with the crowd. We want people in our organization to engage. We want what Matthew Syed in Rebel Ideas calls, divergent or diverse thinking, true diverse thinking, rather than the tokenistic kind that we often see. And then also that we then need to be able to use these to get to a point where we can test the ideas to success or destruction, which often is probably where we would call this agile. Actually, if there is an application of agile here, it is that test loop to make sure that in reality, we're testing to see how reality responds to it or complexity responds to it. This is disruption, because this is the sausage machine of people starting to look at the world around them and seeing and feeling and thinking about how it can be different. And these are all the skills that will make them valuable in the future society, in your future organization and the future economy. If they're millennials or young people who are potentially at risk of being frustrated, it also means that if they're being supported to do all these things and develop them, then maybe you're more likely to keep them as you go forward. So digital help frameworks can absolutely help. But we need to stop the jargon and we need to think about the meaning and make them inclusive. We need to make sure that we're doing them in the right kind of way. And so if, for example, you have a team that's struggling with agile, it may be because they're not able to help people to embrace and be surrounded by it, and it's not being used in an inclusive way. In my accelerator, when I talk about these digital frameworks, I talk in human. I talk about the human drivers that have led to this, not, all of the jargon that we talk, because actually it ends up creating more problems than solutions. If you can engage with this kind of stuff, if you can engage with the sausage machine, starting to create these things, many leaders have for many years been saying to me, probably saying to Craig and others, that, it's so hard to get momentum. It's so hard to get innovation. It's so hard to be able to really progress things forward without some leader being behind it, pushing it up a hill. This is how it can be different, because actually, if you're using this and you're promoting and supporting people's soft skill, dare I say, development, this can be a really sustainable and self-generating power in your organization, because everybody is participating. Everyone's got a say. Everyone's able to move it forward in different ways. And actually, if we can use these solutions to do it responsibly, so this is the process of design thinking, where effectively what we do is, rather than sort of sitting there, often what we've had in the past is a group of people try to guess the solution and they try to prove the solution and they try to get reality to bend to the will of the solution. And we make decisions around that. Like I've been working with CCGs for 17 years, and this tends to be the way that most business cases get viewed. But actually, instead of this, that we're rooting us in trying to understand the nature of the problem. So we've got genuine problem statements with the users inside and outside of our organizations, that we're trying to solve the problem in the right kind of way and deliver the right thing ultimately. Ultimately, what we're talking about through this process is starting to go through diverging and converging, flexing and coming in, having disparate ideas, starting to kind of get lots of different options in terms of the problem and the solution. And if we can do this, what this ultimately means is better decisions, a better process to give confidence in the board. Yes, it may not give the absolute view of precision that maybe we're used to at the moment, but actually what it means is that if from the root to the fruit of our organizations, we are doing this from the front line to the boardroom, and we're all engaged with and understanding this process, what we're actually starting to do is have really great ways of de-risking problems, increasing the likelihood of projects being more successful, ultimately making better decisions. What we're also talking about here is if we're using this approach and we're collecting the information and the data that we use with great research that takes bias out and so on, is that we're starting to become data driven, and not in not in this way where, to borrow a term from before, where maybe bad data is driving us or we're having to jump through hoops because data isn't saying something, but actually we're genuinely connecting to a shift from opinion to fact, or to particular forms of data that are shifting, that are being misused in certain kinds of way, to us having fact. And this is a power shift. This is a decentralization or a devolution of power in our organization, because we're giving everybody the responsibility to make great ideas, to make great learning and great research, the thing that drives the decisions that we make. And that is, for leaders, a lot less pressure to get all of these different things right, because we can start to bathe ourselves in more facts and meaning. It's also a great way to get everybody around you to disrupt. And I'm going to emphasize the term responsibly disrupt and drive change, because actually what we can do is we can have a way where we can all say, have you met the burden of proof? Have you done this particular work? Almost kind of doing the scientific method to kind of work through these things. And it doesn't have to be a massive labor. It can be done quite quickly and easily. But this is then started the shift towards being genuinely data driven. And the reason I point to this is because actually everybody talks about artificial intelligence and Internet of Things and genomics and VR and AR and process automation, all of these different things, which I understand and know pretty well. If we take all of these things apart, if we start to sort of to deconstruct them, what we're talking about is data that we collect from different places, that we take through a machine or a process which is made of data. That could be machine learning, which gives us new insights and new data. And all of these amazing things that we really confuse ourselves about are actually about data. And if we can genuinely understand data, we're in a much better position to be able to understand how we can bring these things together and actually ultimately make them successful. And if we can make that shift towards data-driven thinking over opinions as leaders, then what we're talking about is being in a better position to take on all of these cool things that systems above you might be saying that they would like to see in place within the next 3 to 5 years. But you get to do the cool stuff too, right? Because better data means that you get robots, and who doesn't want robots doing things? Well, I don't know, actually, in some organizations, I'm doing a survey for a large charity at the moment, and there's real concern about how robots are going to come and take away their job. But actually, this cool digital stuff, it's an inevitability. And so just to look at, I suppose, if we were to talk about these robots and these processes to really sort of make it in a human term, what we're talking about is, if we take someone with a manual job, someone who's got admin, as we often describe it in our jobs, right? There's be lots of different processes. And we're moving forward into a position where we can use bots or little robots to automate very specific things. A couple of weeks ago, we had the most mind-blowing thing on the accelerator from an organization that's gone so far down the line and done it in a really responsible way as well. And there's so much, this technology is here and we can achieve this. But actually, often we make decisions. It might be that we make decisions about what the best course of action to take is, or it might be that if this person has done this course, then we need to do that. And ultimately, a lot of the things that are going to be the real power and source of change in your organization will be using automation of the business process or the robot process and intelligent automation combined. What we're talking about is what we were talking about at the beginning of the revolution, which is ultimately we're talking about increasingly automating jobs, people's jobs. And more often, the culmination of people's skills is to be able to service those jobs, which is worrying for those individuals. Now, I remember, sort of coming along to a social club actually in got a couple of years ago when we were talking about these, talking about automation and some of these advanced technologies. And I think there was, and I suppose continues to be, a degree of skepticism about whether we really need this. Your circumstances around you means, the whole environment means that we're going to have to do more for less, and we're going to have to do it lighter. And realistically, your organization is going to have to slim down and start to rid itself of manual work, because it's incredibly expensive, it's incredibly time consuming, it's incredibly fallible, and there isn't really a choice. And so we do need to jump into this with both feet, but in a responsible way. If we can do so, the results can be remarkable, not just for your organizations, not just for the people that you serve, but also for those who you're taking with you, whose roles are potentially being transformed if you have the right mindset. And we need to have that mindset, because if we don't do this, then we're increasing the likelihood that people who you care about in your organization are going to become technologically irrelevant in the future. So we need to prioritize automation soon, now, actually, and to start to think about doing those things. Because actually, this is what's ultimately going to become a really good experience to take people through to improve their long-term prospects. Yes, you may have people who leave roles and you decide not to replace them and so on and so forth. But actually, for those who stick with you, who you don't want to see struggling to get a job in the future, particularly in the field of social, we don't want to increase joblessness, right? Then actually we need to be looking at the long-term prospects and thinking about role transformation and giving people the opportunity to build up their social emotional skills so they're relevant in what comes next. All of the things that I have talked about so far, hopefully, are about different strings or strands of mindset. Our organization shifting, supporting people's skills to shift in the right kinds of way to do different things, taking on culture and the things that happen with that, and also starting to imagine that technology is going to make that shift and how we can do it, starting to think about it. And actually, if we take all of these are all mindset things. Now, if we can get all of these right, as I said, there's so many fantastic things we can do. Yes, there are perils and concerns about the future around what this is going to bring for us in society. I share all of those views as a parent, for myself, as I said. But actually, there's a new frontier of opportunity, particularly for those of you who are looking at diversification. And actually, commercially, there's a significant amount of opportunity that will come for this in terms of thinking very differently about how you can shift. And actually, if we start thinking about, for example, the charity sector, it's probably a massive necessity to shift that commercial focus, and digital can play a really great role. So there's so many opportunities that come from this. I suppose just to go back to, those leaders who wonder, am I relevant? What could my role be? Can I support this? Who else can make such a tectonic environmental shift? Who can connect with that change? Is it someone who's 2 rungs down in your middle management team who's learning digital skills? Is it that digital person that you brought in, or the guy in IT who's trying to bring something around? They can help, but you're the ones that can do this. You're the ones that need to do this change, because if you don't, then your organization probably won't be able to move at the speed it needs to. And well, what outcome does that lead to, really? So I suppose to conclude this point on a note of positivity, start the mission, start it now. Think about your role as the captain, try and enable and galvanize those around you, help everybody understand that you're all on a digital ship together, and try and take that step forward into the future, because, hopefully it's going to be remarkable, but it's pretty inevitable. And, we need to move forward either way. And that's the important role of a leader. So I know that I have, as I said at the beginning, taken many, many, many hours, tens of hours, and tried to put this into 1 hour. And I suppose, what I'm going to be talking about, I suppose, in my final slides is, as I said at the beginning, this is what I do. This is the massive and meaningful mission that I am trying to bring to this world, and that I would like to help you with. This is something that I would like to be able to support you, whether it be in conversations about tricky things, or, walking together to kind of take that journey. And the vessel that I have used for this, because I want to help as many organizations as possible and to support that journey, has increasingly been through what we call accelerator programs, which, as it says on the tin, is to help people move faster, to be able to move faster into this future and understand this. We have 2. We have an executive program, which I'll come to in a moment. And we have the Disruptor program. The first one has been going throughout 2021 and has been a wonderful privilege and a success. And the next one is starting in 2022. So the exec one is starting relatively soon, November, maybe December. I'm flexible and agile, shall we say. So I suppose the overview of the exec program is that we're going to be taking, unsurprisingly, these 12 topics that I've been talking about into longer 2.5 hour sessions where we really delve down and talk about what we see now in the changing world. And because of the executives, like we do actually have a medical director and we have a director of ops who are on the disruptors. It's not like I'm splitting and saying leaders and non-leaders, but actually what I've heard from many leaders is that doing half a day every single Friday is a very challenging thing for most executives, particularly in the environment that we're in. And so this is trying to condense it down to 30 hours, 12 2.5 hour sessions every 3 to 4 weeks, depending on how holidays fall and so on, with direct mentoring sessions that I provide, peer activities, and also a whole range of shared resources and learning, a lot of which will be taken from the main accelerator if, for example, you want to get your heads into some of these things in a bit more detail. And they're all familiar flavors. This hopefully is the journey that we've been through today over the last hour: the industrial revolution, the care revolution, skills, gateways and governance, strategy, data as a driving force, automation, the 24/7 employee, and also the digital commercial offerings. And so if you'd like to find out more, I think Dave will be popping the link through in a moment, but you can go to sector3.tech-catalyst. You can check out the prospectus, as all the information. We've got a test to be able to see how you score around your understanding in different areas, but also, like, if you want to drop an email or book in for a discussion, then be absolutely fine, absolutely happy to do that. And so it may sound like I like self-promotion from my excitement over this stuff, and I absolutely love the mission, but I've got to kind of do this because, like, we've had some absolutely humbling feedback. But what I'm going to do, I suppose, is show you these and just not read them out because it's going to make me blush. But what I would say is that actually from this year, from 2021, from those organizations that represent such an incredible need to save social enterprise, to save their organization being crushed by ICSs, dealing with this environment around us, it's been such a humbling experience to see the level of empowerment those individuals that I've been working with and continue to work with as we conclude the first cohort of the accelerator. And actually, these are the individuals who are going to be going forward and really starting to disrupt their organizations. And so hopefully, if any of you would like to, jump onto one of these catalysts and take that journey, it'd be an absolute privilege to help, you guys to be able to see how you could potentially, really make the best possible opportunities and chances for your future in an uncertain, a complex and increasingly disruptive world. Because actually what I've seen quite often has been that this is something that feels quite scary. It feels quite challenging. But when people really start to understand what it is and what it means, all of this digital stuff in this digital age, the residual feeling is they're excited, they feel empowered, and they know that they can do so much stuff, and they feel more in control of their future. And that's where I hope that we can end up being. And if we can, then the future holds so much opportunity and so many exciting, wonderful things for us.